The gunshot cracked through the mountain air just as the stagecoach rounded the bend, and Josephine Zimmerman felt her entire world tilt sideways as the driver slumped forward with a groan that made her blood run cold. She gripped the leather seat beneath her, her knuckles white as the horses screamed and the coach lurched violently to one side. The other passenger, an elderly banker from Denver, tumbled against the door with a sickening thud. Then came the voices, rough and jubilant, whooping like coyotes as riders materialized from the rocks on either side of the narrow trail. 5 of them, maybe 6, their faces covered with bandanas that couldn't hide the cruel glint in their eyes. "Stop those damned horses!" one of them shouted, and Josephine watched through the window as a rider with a black hat shot his pistol into the air. The horses reared and screamed, foam flying from their mouths, but they stopped. They had no choice. The door flew open with such force it nearly came off its hinges. A man with tobacco-stained teeth and breath that reeked of whiskey grabbed Josephine by the arm and yanked her from the coach. She hit the ground hard, her traveling dress tearing at the hem, dirt coating her palms as she tried to break her fall. "Well, well," the man said, his voice thick with something that made Josephine's stomach turn. "Ain't this a pretty surprise?" "Please," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Take whatever you want. The strong box is under the driver's seat." "Oh, we will," another outlaw said, this one taller, with a scar running from his eyebrow to his jaw. "But we might just take you too, sweetheart. Been a long time since we had company on the trail." The banker tried to intervene, stumbling from the coach with his hands raised. "Now see here, gentlemen, this is unnecessary." The crack of a pistol butt against his skull sent him crumpling to the dirt like a puppet with cut strings. Josephine screamed, but the sound died in her throat as the scarred man turned his attention back to her. "Get the strong box," he ordered the others. "Tie her hands. She's coming with us." The rough hemp rope bit into Josephine's wrists as they bound her, the fibers already rubbing her skin raw. Her mind raced, searching for options, for any way out of this nightmare. She had been traveling from her aunt's home in Santa Fe back to her father's ranch outside Colorado City, a journey she had made a dozen times before without incident. The year was 1876, and the Colorado Territory had supposedly been tamed, the worst of the outlaw gangs broken up or driven into Mexico. Her father had assured her the route was safe now. He had been wrong. They hauled her onto a horse, forcing her to sit in front of one of the outlaws while he held the reins. The smell of him, unwashed and rank, made her eyes water. As they rode away from the stagecoach, she caught one last glimpse of the driver's body slumped in his seat and the banker lying motionless in the dirt. Guilt and terror warred in her chest. Were they dead? Would anyone find them? Would anyone come looking for her? The outlaws pushed hard through the afternoon, following game trails that wound higher into the mountains. Josephine tried to memorize landmarks, tried to keep track of directions, but as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, everything started to blur together. Pine trees and granite outcroppings, rushing streams and steep ravines, it all looked the same after a while. "Where are you taking me?" she finally asked, her voice hoarse. The scarred man, who seemed to be the leader, rode up beside her. "Got ourselves a camp about 10 miles from here. Nice and remote. Nobody's going to find us there, and nobody's going to find you." "My father will pay ransom," Josephine said quickly. "He owns one of the largest cattle operations in the territory. He has money." The outlaw laughed, a sound like gravel being ground underfoot. "That's so. Well, maybe we'll send him a letter then, after we've had our fun with you." The words sent ice through her veins, but Josephine forced herself to stay calm. Panic would only make things worse. She had to survive, had to keep her wits about her. Whatever these men had planned, she would find a way to endure it, to escape it. She had to. They rode until full dark, finally stopping in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. A crude camp had been set up here, with bedrolls scattered around a fire pit and supplies stashed under a canvas tarp. The outlaws dismounted, and Josephine was dragged from the horse with no ceremony whatsoever. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, stiff from hours in the saddle. "Tie her to that tree," the scarred man ordered, "and somebody get a fire going. I'm starving." They bound her to a thick pine trunk, the rope wrapped around her waist and chest so tightly she could barely breathe. As the outlaws set about making camp, arguing over whose turn it was to cook and passing around a bottle of what looked like rot-gut whiskey, Josephine closed her eyes and tried not to cry. She was 22 years old, unmarried despite her father's attempts at matchmaking, and she had always prided herself on being practical and level-headed. None of that seemed to matter now. The fire crackled to life, casting dancing shadows across the clearing. The outlaws ate beans and jerky, laughing and boasting about the strongbox they had taken. Apparently it had contained nearly $2,000 in paper currency and gold coins, payment for a mining operation in the mountains. They talked about what they would spend their shares on, whores and whiskey mostly, and Josephine tried to block out their voices. As the night wore on and the bottle was emptied, the scarred man stood and walked over to her. Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs. "You hungry?" he asked, almost conversational. "No," she lied. "Thirsty?" She hesitated, then nodded. He brought her a canteen and held it to her lips, and she drank gratefully despite the metallic taste of the water. When she finished, he stayed close, studying her face in the firelight. "Pretty thing," he muttered. "Real pretty. What's a girl like you doing traveling alone?" "I wasn't alone," Josephine said. "There was a driver and another passenger." "Both dead by now, I reckon. That driver took a bullet to the chest, and the old man's skull cracked like an egg." He said it so casually, as if he were discussing the weather. "Your daddy's going to be real upset when he finds out what happened to his little girl." "Then let me go," Josephine said, meeting his eyes. "Let me go and there won't be any trouble. I'll tell them I escaped. I won't identify any of you." The scarred man smiled, revealing yellowed teeth with several gaps. "Now why would we do that? You're worth more to us than any strongbox. Pretty young thing like you, we can have some fun before we decide what to do with you." He reached out and touched her cheek, and Josephine jerked her head away. His expression darkened. "You better learn some manners, sweetheart, else things are going to get real unpleasant real fast." He walked back to the fire, and Josephine sagged against the tree, her mind racing. She had to get away, tonight, if possible. But how? The ropes were too tight, and even if she could free herself, the outlaws would hear her. They might be drunk, but they were still dangerous, still armed. The hours crept by. The outlaws eventually settled into their bedrolls, though one of them stayed awake to keep watch. Josephine could see his silhouette against the dying fire, a rifle across his lap. Her wrists ached where the rope had rubbed them raw, and her back throbbed from being pressed against the rough bark of the tree. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the driver falling, heard the crack of the pistol butt against the banker's skull. Somewhere in the darkest part of the night, she heard something. A sound so faint she almost missed it, a soft rustle in the underbrush beyond the firelight. The guard heard it too. He stood, raising his rifle, peering into the darkness. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice uncertain. No answer. The forest was silent except for the whisper of wind through the pines. The guard took a few steps toward the edge of the clearing, and Josephine held her breath. Then, so quickly she almost didn't see it, a shadow detached itself from the darkness, and the guard crumpled without a sound. One moment he was standing, the next he was on the ground, still as death. Josephine's eyes went wide. What was happening? The shadow moved again, and now she could see it was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for someone his size. He stepped into the faint light of the dying fire, and Josephine's breath caught in her throat. He was massive, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so wide they blocked out the trees behind him. Long, dark hair hung past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskin clothing, a heavy coat made of animal hides, and he carried a knife in one hand that gleamed wickedly in the firelight. But it was his eyes that held her attention, dark and intense, studying her with an intelligence that belied his wild appearance. He moved toward her with that same uncanny silence, and Josephine realized she should be terrified. This man could be anyone, could be worse than the outlaws. But something in his eyes, something in the way he moved, told her he wasn't here to hurt her. He knelt beside her and raised a finger to his lips, a clear signal for silence. Then he set to work on the ropes with his knife, cutting through the hemp with quick, efficient strokes. The moment her hands were free, Josephine had to stifle a gasp as blood rushed back into her fingers, bringing with it 1,000 needle pricks of pain. The man helped her to her feet, one large hand steadying her when her legs threatened to give out. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear, and whispered in a voice like distant thunder, "Can you walk?" Josephine nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then follow me. Step where I step. Make no sound." He led her away from the camp, moving through the forest with the confidence of someone who knew every tree, every rock, every shadow. Josephine did her best to follow his example, placing her feet carefully, avoiding branches that might snap. Behind them, the outlaws slept on, oblivious to the fact that their captive was slipping away into the night. They walked for what felt like hours, though it could have been less. Josephine's body screamed in protest, exhaustion and fear taking their toll, but she pushed on. The alternative was too terrible to consider. Finally, when the first gray light of dawn was just beginning to touch the eastern sky, the man stopped in a small clearing beside a rushing stream. "We rest here," he said, his voice still low. "They will wake soon and find you gone. They will track us." Josephine sank down onto a fallen log, her legs shaking. "Who are you?" she asked. The man knelt by the stream, filling a canteen with fresh water. "Name's Pierce Patterson," he said. "I live in these mountains." "You're a mountain man," Josephine said, the pieces falling into place. She had heard stories of such men, trappers and hunters who lived alone in the wilderness, trading furs and game in the small settlements that dotted the territory. They were considered half-wild themselves, more comfortable with bears and wolves than with civilized company. "Some call me that," Pierce said. He offered her the canteen, and she drank deeply, the cold water soothing her parched throat. "I saw those men take you from the stage. Been tracking them since yesterday afternoon." "You saw?" Josephine stared at him. "Why didn't you help sooner?" 6 armed men against one. Pierce's dark eyes met hers, and she saw a flicker of something that might have been amusement. "I'm good, but I'm not foolish. Waited until they were drunk and sleeping. Easier that way." "You killed the guard," Josephine said, remembering the way the man had fallen. "Didn't kill him, knocked him cold. He'll wake with a headache, nothing more." Pierce stood, scanning the forest around them. "We need to keep moving. There's a cabin about 5 miles from here, place I use when I'm trapping this part of the range. We can rest there, decide what to do next." "I need to get to Colorado City," Josephine said. "My father, he'll be worried sick when he hears about the stage." "Colorado City is 2 days' ride from here, and those outlaws are between us and it," Pierce said. "First priority is keeping you alive and away from them. We'll worry about getting you home after that." It made sense, even if Josephine hated the delay. She stood, ignoring the protests of her tired muscles. "Then let's go." Pierce studied her for a moment, and Josephine had the distinct impression he was reassessing her. Maybe he had expected her to argue, or to break down in tears. Instead, she met his gaze steadily, waiting for him to lead the way. The corner of his mouth twitched beneath his beard, almost a smile. "This way," he said, and set off through the trees. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was more substantial than Josephine had expected. Built of thick logs chinked with mud and moss, it had a solid door with a bar that could be lowered from the inside and 2 small windows with wooden shutters. Inside, it was spare but clean, with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and chairs, a bed covered with furs and shelves stocked with supplies. "You live here?" Josephine asked, looking around. "Sometimes," Pierce said. He was already moving around the space with practiced efficiency, checking the fire pit, inspecting his supplies. "I've got 3 or 4 places like this scattered through the mountains. Use them depending on where the game is, what season it is." "It must be lonely," Josephine said without thinking. Pierce paused, then shrugged. "I prefer my own company to most people's." There was a story there, Josephine sensed, but she didn't press. The man had saved her life, had risked his own safety to slip her away from those outlaws. Whatever his past, whatever his reasons for living alone in these mountains, he had proven himself trustworthy when it mattered most. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for what you did. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." Pierce's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the hard, guarded expression softened. "You're safe now," he said. "That's what matters." He set about building a fire while Josephine sank into one of the chairs, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been building for hours. She watched him work, noting the easy strength in his movements, the way his muscles flexed beneath his buckskin shirt. Everything about him spoke of power held in check, of a man who was completely at home in this wild place. When the fire was crackling, Pierce put together a simple meal of cornbread and venison jerky, along with coffee so strong it nearly made Josephine's eyes water. But it was warm, and it was food, and she ate gratefully, feeling her strength slowly returning. "Tell me about those men," Pierce said as they ate. "You know who they are?" Josephine shook her head. "Just outlaws. They stopped the stage, shot the driver, took the strongbox, and me." She swallowed hard, remembering. There were 6 of them. The leader had a scar on his face, from his eyebrow to his jaw. Pierce's expression darkened. "That's Jake Carson. Bad man, real bad. He's been operating in these mountains for the better part of a year, robbing stages and supply wagons. Marshals have been looking for him, but he's slippery, knows the land too well." "How do you know him?" "Ran into him once, up near Leadville. He tried to steal my furs, figured I was just some dumb trapper he could push around." Pierce's smile was cold. He figured wrong. "I sent him packing with a broken nose and a warning. Guess the scar is new." "He said they were going to keep me," Josephine said quietly. "Said they'd have their fun and then decide what to do with me." Pierce's jaw tightened, and Josephine saw his hands curl into fists. "That won't happen. I give you my word." The conviction in his voice, the sheer certainty of it, made something in Josephine's chest loosen. She believed him. This stranger, this wild mountain man with his long hair and buckskin clothes, she believed he would protect her. They spent the rest of the day at the cabin, Pierce keeping watch at the windows while Josephine rested. He had given her the bed, insisting he would sleep on the floor, and though she had protested, he had been immovable on the point. As evening fell and shadows lengthened across the forest floor, Josephine found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking. He was younger than she had first thought, probably no more than 26 or 27. His face, what she could see of it beneath the beard, was ruggedly handsome, all strong lines and hard angles. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who had worked hard his entire life. And his eyes, those dark, watchful eyes, held a depth of experience that suggested he had seen more than most men twice his age. "You keep staring at me like that. I'm going to think I've got something on my face," Pierce said without turning from the window. Josephine felt heat rush to her cheeks. "I'm sorry, I was just thinking." "About what?" "About why a man like you lives alone in the mountains," she said honestly. Pierce was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Came out here 5 years ago. Was a soldier before that, fought in the tail end of the war, and then did some time in the cavalry, chasing hostile tribes through Dakota territory. Saw things, did things, that made me not want to be around people anymore. These mountains, they don't judge, they don't lie. You live or you die based on your own choices, your own skills. It's honest in a way civilization never is." "That sounds lonely," Josephine said again. "Maybe," Pierce acknowledged, "but it's peaceful too, or it was, until Jake Carson and his gang started operating in my territory." "Your territory?" "I've been trapping these mountains for 5 years. I know every valley, every pass, every watering hole. Makes it mine in a way." He finally turned from the window, his expression serious. "Those men will come looking for you, Josephine. They won't give up easy. Carson especially. He's got a mean streak in him, and he doesn't like being made a fool of." "Then what do we do?" "We stay ahead of them. Keep moving, use the terrain to our advantage. I can get you back to Colorado City, but it'll take time, and we'll need to be careful." Josephine nodded, though the thought of spending days on the run, always looking over her shoulder, made her stomach twist with anxiety. But what choice did she have? Pierce was right. Those outlaws wouldn't just let her go. She had seen their faces, could identify them. And more than that, she had wounded their pride by escaping. Men like Jake Carson didn't forget things like that. That night, lying in the bed covered with soft furs, Josephine found sleep elusive despite her exhaustion. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, made her heart jump. But each time, she would see Pierce's silhouette by the window, standing watch, and she would force herself to breathe, to relax. He had saved her once. She had to trust he would do it again if it came to that. Morning came cold and clear, frost sparkling on the grass outside the cabin. Pierce had coffee ready and more cornbread, along with strips of bacon he fried in a cast-iron skillet. They ate quickly, and then Pierce began gathering supplies, packing everything into a large leather bag that he slung over his shoulder with ease. "We'll head north," he said. "There's old mining trails up in the high country, places those outlaws won't know about. We can circle around, come at Colorado City from the north instead of the south. It'll add time, but it's safer." "How much time?" 4 days, maybe 5. Pierce met her eyes. "I know that's not what you want to hear, but it's the best option we've got." "My father will be beside himself," Josephine said, "when he hears about the stage, when they find the bodies." "You said the driver took a bullet to the chest?" "Yes." "And the other passenger, the old man?" They hit him with a pistol. He went down hard." Pierce frowned. "They might both be dead, you're right. But there's a chance someone found them, got them help. Either way, your father will know something happened. Question is whether he'll assume you're dead too, or if he'll hold out hope." The thought of her father grieving for her, believing her dead, made Josephine's throat tight. But Pierce was right. They had to be smart about this. Running straight back to Colorado City might be what the outlaws expected, might be what they were waiting for. "All right," she said, "north it is." They set out shortly after sunrise, Pierce leading the way along trails that Josephine would never have spotted on her own. He moved with that same quiet confidence, his eyes constantly scanning the forest, his body language alert without seeming tense. Josephine did her best to keep up, grateful that she had always been active and fit, comfortable on horseback and walking. Her father's ranch had required hard work from everyone, including her, and she had never been one to shy away from physical challenges. Still, this was different. This was hours of steady hiking, climbing over fallen logs and scrambling up rocky slopes, always pushing higher into the mountains. By midday, Josephine's legs were burning, and her breath came in gasps as the air grew thinner. Pierce noticed, of course. He slowed his pace, calling more frequent breaks, offering her water and strips of jerky. "You're doing good," he said during one such break, and Josephine felt an absurd rush of pride at the simple compliment. "I grew up on a ranch," she said. "I'm not some delicate flower who faints at the first sign of trouble." Pierce's eyes crinkled at the corners, and Josephine realized he was smiling beneath his beard. "I can see that." They made camp that evening in a small cave Pierce knew of, tucked into the side of a granite cliff. It was shallow but dry, and it had the advantage of being invisible from below. Pierce built a tiny fire at the back of the cave, just enough for warmth and to heat water for coffee, and they ate a cold supper of jerky and hardtack. "You think they're still looking for us?" Josephine asked as the last light faded from the sky. "Oh, they're looking," Pierce said. "Question is whether they can track us. I've been covering our trail as best I can, but Carson's got some experienced men with him. If they've got a good tracker, they might pick up our sign. And if they do? Then we deal with it." Pierce met her eyes across the small fire. "I told you I'd keep you safe, Josephine. I meant it." There was something in the way he said her name, something that made Josephine's pulse quicken. She told herself it was just the adrenaline, the fear and exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. But she couldn't deny the way she felt when Pierce looked at her, the sense of safety and something else, something warmer and more dangerous. The next 2 days passed in a blur of hiking, climbing, and hiding. They saw no sign of the outlaws, but Pierce never let his guard down, never stopped watching and listening. At night, they would camp in whatever shelter Pierce could find, caves or dense thickets of pine, and Josephine would fall asleep to the sound of his steady breathing, knowing he was keeping watch. On the 3rd day, they crested a high ridge, and Josephine could see for miles in every direction. The mountains stretched out in waves of blue and purple, their peaks still capped with snow despite the late summer warmth. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, wild and untamed and utterly magnificent. "This is your home," she said softly, and it wasn't a question. Pierce stood beside her, his eyes on the distant peaks. "Yes, I can see why you love it." He turned to look at her, and Josephine felt the weight of his gaze. Not many women would understand that. "I'm not most women," Josephine said, and Pierce smiled, a real smile this time, open and warm. "No," he agreed, "you're not." They started down the far side of the ridge, and Josephine found herself thinking about what would happen when they reached Colorado City. Pierce would deliver her to her father, and then what? Would he disappear back into his mountains, back to his solitary life? The thought bothered her more than it should have. Late that afternoon, as they picked their way along a narrow trail above a steep ravine, Pierce suddenly stopped and held up a hand. Josephine froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Pierce's entire body had gone tense, his head cocked as if listening to something she couldn't hear. Then she heard it too. Voices, men's voices, echoing up from somewhere below. Pierce grabbed her arm and pulled her off the trail into a thick stand of pine trees. They crouched there, barely breathing, as the voices grew louder. Through the branches, Josephine could see movement on the trail below. 4 men on horseback, riding slowly, their eyes on the ground. One of them was Jake Carson. Josephine's blood ran cold. How had they found them? Pierce had been so careful, covering their tracks, choosing routes that would be nearly impossible to follow. But here they were clearly tracking something. "They must have picked up our trail back near the cabin," Pierce whispered in her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "We need to move, now." But it was too late. One of the men below suddenly reined in his horse and pointed up toward the ridge. "There, I saw movement. Go!" Pierce hissed, and Josephine ran. They crashed through the forest, abandoning all pretense of stealth in favor of speed. Behind them, Josephine could hear the outlaws shouting, the thunder of hoofbeats as they spurred their horses up the slope. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed in protest, but she pushed herself harder, following Pierce as he led her through the trees with desperate urgency. A gunshot cracked, and bark exploded from a tree inches from Josephine's head. She cried out but didn't stop, couldn't stop. Pierce grabbed her hand, pulling her after him as they ran. They burst out of the trees onto a rocky outcropping, and Josephine's heart sank as she realized they had been driven into a corner. The outcropping jutted out over a sheer cliff with the forest behind them and nowhere else to go. They were trapped. The outlaws emerged from the trees seconds later, their guns drawn. Jake Carson dismounted with a grin that made Josephine's skin crawl. "Well, well," he said. "End of the line, sweetheart. You led us on quite a chase, I'll give you that. But it's over now." Pierce stepped in front of Josephine, his body a shield between her and the outlaws. "You're making a mistake, Carson." Carson's eyes narrowed as he recognized Pierce. "Patterson, I should have known. Can't mind your own business, can you?" "Let her go," Pierce said, his voice deadly calm. "This is between you and me." "Oh, it's way past that now," Carson said. "You made me look like a fool, slipping into my camp and stealing what's mine. Now I'm going to make you watch while I take her back, and then I'm going to put a bullet in your skull. Sound fair?" The other 3 outlaws had spread out, forming a semicircle with their guns all pointed at Pierce. Josephine's mind raced. There was no way out. Even if Pierce fought, he was outnumbered and outgunned. They were both going to die here on this rocky outcropping, or worse, she would be taken back to their camp and Pierce would be killed. "No," she said, stepping out from behind Pierce. "I'll go with you. Just let him live." "Josephine, no," Pierce growled, but she ignored him. "I'll go with you willingly," she said to Carson. "No more running, no more trouble. Just let Pierce go." Carson considered this, his head tilted like a predator studying its prey. "That's real sweet, sweetheart. Real noble. But see, I don't think I'm going to do that. I think I'm going to take you and kill him anyway, because I can." He raised his pistol, aiming it at Pierce's chest, and Josephine screamed. But before Carson could pull the trigger, Pierce moved. He was impossibly fast, faster than any man his size had a right to be, diving to the side as the gun went off. The bullet struck rock, sending chips of granite flying, and then Pierce was rolling, his hand coming up with a knife that flashed in the late afternoon sun. The knife flew through the air and buried itself in the shoulder of the outlaw to Carson's left. The man screamed and dropped his gun, clutching at the blade. Pierce used the distraction to charge Carson, slamming into him with the force of a runaway bull. They went down in a tangle of limbs, fighting for control of Carson's pistol. The other 2 outlaws tried to get a clear shot, but Pierce and Carson were moving too fast, rolling across the rocky ground. Josephine saw her chance. She lunged for the fallen gun of the wounded outlaw, her fingers closing around the grip just as one of the other men turned toward her. "Don't," she said, raising the weapon with shaking hands. She had never shot anyone in her life, had barely even held a gun, but desperation lent her courage. Don't move or I swear I'll shoot. The outlaw hesitated, clearly weighing his options. In that moment of indecision, Pierce managed to tear Carson's gun away and smash it into the outlaw leader's face. There was a sickening crunch, and Carson went limp. Pierce surged to his feet, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, and turned to face the two remaining outlaws. His eyes were wild, his teeth bared in a feral snarl, and in that moment he looked every inch the dangerous mountain man the stories painted him as. Your choice, he said, his voice rough. Walk away now or end up like Carson. The outlaws exchanged glances. Then, slowly, they lowered their guns and backed toward their horses. The wounded man stumbled after them, Pierce's knife still protruding from his shoulder. They mounted up and rode away without another word, leaving Carson unconscious on the ground. Pierce swayed, and Josephine dropped the gun and rushed to his side. Are you hurt? I'm fine, he said, but there was blood soaking through his shirt, spreading across his ribs. Just a scratch. That's not a scratch, Josephine said, her hands already reaching for the hem of his shirt. Let me see. Pierce tried to wave her off, but he was clearly weakening. Josephine pulled his shirt up and bit back a gasp. A deep gash ran along his left side, just below his ribs, bleeding freely. One of the outlaws must have had a knife she hadn't seen. We need to get this cleaned and bandaged, she said, forcing herself to stay calm. Is there water nearby? Stream, Pierce managed, pointing down the slope. 1/4 mile. Can you walk? I can walk. But he couldn't, not really. By the time they reached the stream, Pierce was leaning heavily on Josephine, his face pale beneath his beard. She eased him down onto the bank and set about tearing strips from her petticoat to use as bandages. The cold stream water was clean, and she used it to wash the wound as gently as she could, trying to ignore Pierce's sharp intakes of breath. You saved my life, she said as she worked. Again. Just returning the favor, Pierce said, attempting a smile. You distracted them, gave me the opening I needed. I thought they were going to kill you. They tried. His hand came up to cover hers, stilling her movements. Josephine, look at me. She met his eyes, those dark eyes that had watched over her for 3 days, that had kept her safe when no one else could. I'm not going to let anything happen to you, he said, no matter what it costs, you understand? Josephine nodded, not trusting her voice. There was something in his eyes, something that made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. She realized, with a start, that she cared about this man. More than cared. In 3 short days, Pierce Patterson had become more important to her than people she had known her entire life. She finished bandaging his wound, wrapping the strips of cloth tightly around his torso. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold until they could get proper medical attention. Pierce stood, testing his range of motion, and nodded. We need to keep moving, he said. Carson's men might come back with reinforcements. What about Carson himself? Pierce glanced back toward the outcropping. He's alive. I checked his pulse before we left. He'll wake up eventually with a broken nose and a splitting headache. If he's smart, he'll take it as a warning and leave this territory. They walked until full dark, Pierce pushing himself despite his injury. Finally, he led Josephine to another of his cabins, this one smaller than the first, just a single room with a fireplace and a sleeping platform built into the wall. But it was shelter, and it was safe, and Josephine was grateful for both. She made Pierce sit while she built the fire and prepared a simple meal from the supplies stored in the cabin. His color was a bit better now, but the bandage was spotted with blood, and she worried about infection. They needed to get to Colorado City, to a real doctor, but Pierce had been right earlier. Another day or two to make sure Carson's men were truly gone, to take the safer route. That was the smart choice. That night, as they sat by the fire, Josephine found herself talking. She told Pierce about her life, about growing up on her father's ranch, about her mother who had died when she was 12, about her dreams of seeing more of the country, maybe even traveling back east to visit relatives in Philadelphia. Pierce listened, his eyes on her face, and when she finally ran out of words, he shared his own stories. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, about the war and what he had seen, about the day he decided to leave civilization behind and strike out for the mountains. Do you ever regret it? Josephine asked, leaving everything behind? I did at first, Pierce admitted. Those first winters were hard. I nearly died twice, once from cold and once from a grizzly bear that didn't take kindly to me stumbling into her den. But I learned. I adapted. And after a while, I realized I was happier alone than I had ever been surrounded by people. Until now, Josephine said softly. Pierce's eyes met hers, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. Until now, he agreed. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. Then Pierce stood, moving to check the door and windows, and the spell was broken. Josephine told herself she was imagining things, that the fear and exhaustion were making her read too much into simple words and glances. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them, something important. The next day, Pierce declared himself fit to travel, though Josephine could see the pain in his eyes when he moved too quickly. They set out at a slower pace, following trails that gradually descended from the high country. The land changed as they lost elevation, the pine forests giving way to aspen groves with their white bark and shimmering leaves, then to scrubland dotted with juniper and sage. By late afternoon on the fourth day, they could see Colorado City in the distance, a sprawl of buildings clustered at the base of the mountains. Josephine felt a rush of emotion at the sight. She was almost home, almost safe, almost back to her normal life. But as they descended the final slope toward the town, she found herself dragging her feet, not quite ready for this journey to end. Because once they reached Colorado City, once Pierce delivered her to her father, he would leave. He would return to his mountains and his solitary life, and she would never see him again. The realization hurt more than she wanted to admit. They reached the outskirts of town just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. People stared as they passed, taking in Pierce's wild appearance and Josephine's torn and dirty traveling dress. Josephine ignored them, her eyes fixed on the large house at the end of Main Street, the house she had grown up in. Her father was on the porch, pacing back and forth, and when he saw her, he froze. Then he was running, his boots thudding against the wooden boardwalk, his face twisted with emotions Josephine couldn't begin to name. "Josephine!" he shouted, and she broke into a run, meeting him halfway. He caught her in his arms, crushing her against his chest, and Josephine felt tears streaming down her face. "Papa," she sobbed. "Papa, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "You're alive," her father said, his voice choked. "My God, you're alive. When they brought in the stage, when they said you were taken, I thought I'd lost you. I thought you were gone." "I'm here," Josephine said. "I'm safe. Pierce saved me." Her father pulled back, his eyes finding Pierce for the first time. The mountain man stood a few paces away, his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable with the attention. Josephine's father released her and strode toward Pierce, his hand extended. "You saved my daughter's life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "James Zimmerman, I owe you a debt I can never repay." Pierce shook his hand, clearly out of his element. "Just did what was right, sir." "What's your name, son?" "Pierce Patterson." "Mr. Patterson, I insist you stay for dinner. Stay as long as you need. My home is yours." Pierce glanced at Josephine, and she saw the uncertainty in his eyes. He was already planning to leave, she realized, already preparing to slip away back into the mountains where he belonged. The thought made her heart clench. "Please," she said, before Pierce could make an excuse. "Please stay, at least for tonight." Pierce looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded. "All right. Tonight." Dinner was a chaotic affair. Word had spread quickly that Josephine was home safe, and neighbors came by in a steady stream to see for themselves, to hear the story of her kidnapping and rescue. Josephine told the tale multiple times, carefully editing out the worst parts, focusing on Pierce's bravery and skill. Her father insisted on sending for the town doctor to check Pierce's wound, and the man pronounced it healing cleanly, though he re-bandaged it with proper dressings and stern instructions to take it easy for a few days. Through it all, Pierce sat quietly, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. But Josephine noticed the way his eyes kept finding her, the way he would relax slightly whenever she was near. It gave her hope, foolish as that hope might be. Later, after the last of the neighbors had left and her father had retired for the night, Josephine found Pierce on the back porch, staring out at the mountains silhouetted against the night sky. "You're planning to leave at first light," she said. It wasn't a question. Pierce nodded. It's what I do. I don't belong in towns, Josephine. I don't know how to be around people anymore. Then teach me, Josephine said impulsively. Teach me how to live in the mountains. Pierce turned to stare at her. What? I've been thinking about it all day, Josephine said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I don't fit here either, Pierce. I never have. My father wants me to marry some rancher or businessman, settle down and be a proper society wife. But that's not who I am. These past few days, even with the danger, even with the fear, I felt more alive than I've felt in years. Out there in the wilderness, with you, I felt like I was finally where I was meant to be. Josephine, you don't know what you're saying. Life in the mountains, it's hard, it's lonely, there's no comfort, no safety net. You make one mistake and it can cost you your life. I know that. I saw it. And I'm not afraid. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the conflict in his eyes. I'm asking you to give me a chance, give us a chance, because I think you feel it too, this thing between us, don't you? Pierce was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and cupped her cheek with his rough, calloused hand. I felt it from the moment I saw you tied to that tree, he said quietly. You were so brave, so strong. I knew right then you were different from anyone I'd ever met. Then why are you fighting this? Because I don't want to take you away from your home, your family. Because I don't want you to regret it in 5 years when you realize what you've given up. The only thing I'll regret is letting you walk away, Josephine said fiercely. Pierce, I'm 22 years old. I'm not some naive girl with foolish romantic notions. I know my own mind, and I know what I want. I want you. I want the life we could build together. Pierce's thumb stroked across her cheekbone, and Josephine saw the moment his resolve crumbled. He leaned down and kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper, his arms coming around her to pull her close. Josephine melted into him, her hands sliding up to tangle in his long hair. The kiss tasted of coffee and hope and new beginnings, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Your father's going to have my head, Pierce said, but he was smiling. My father will understand, Josephine said. Eventually. And if he doesn't, well, I stopped needing his permission a long time ago. They talked long into the night, making plans, discussing practicalities. Pierce would need to teach her everything, survival skills and hunting and how to read the land. Josephine would need time to prepare, to gather supplies, to say goodbye to her father properly. It wouldn't be an easy life, but it would be theirs, and that was all that mattered. The next morning, Josephine sat down with her father over breakfast and told him everything. To her surprise, James Zimmerman didn't rage or forbid her from going. Instead, he looked at her with sad, knowing eyes. You have your mother's spirit, he said. She was never one for settled life either. I always knew you'd leave one day, find your own path. I just hoped I'd have you here a bit longer. I'm not going far, Josephine said, taking his hand. Just up into the mountains. I'll come visit, I promise. And you can come see us too, once we're settled. Her father looked at Pierce, who stood respectfully to the side. You'll take care of her? With my life, Pierce said simply. Then I suppose I have no choice but to give you my blessing. Her father stood and embraced Josephine tightly. Be happy, daughter. That's all I've ever wanted for you. It took 2 weeks to prepare properly. Josephine needed clothing suitable for mountain life, supplies that would see them through the coming winter, tools and equipment that Pierce didn't already have scattered among his various cabins. James Zimmerman, once he accepted his daughter's decision, threw himself into helping, using his considerable wealth and connections to ensure they would want for nothing. During those 2 weeks, Josephine and Pierce spent every possible moment together. He taught her to shoot properly, to track game, to identify edible plants and dangerous animals. She was a quick study, her natural intelligence and determination serving her well. Pierce, for his part, slowly began to open up, to share more of himself. Josephine learned about his fears and his dreams, about the nightmares that still haunted him from the war, about his deep love for the mountains and everything they represented. They were married 3 days before they left for the high country, a simple ceremony in the small church at the edge of town. Josephine wore a practical dress of sturdy cotton, and Pierce had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, looking almost civilized in clean buckskin and a borrowed jacket. Her father walked her down the aisle, tears tears streaming openly down his face, and Pierce's hands shook as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. "I love you," he whispered as they sealed their vows with a kiss. "I'll spend the rest of my life showing you how much." "I love you too," Josephine whispered back. "My wild mountain man." Their wedding night was spent in one of the cabins, the same one where Pierce had first brought her after the rescue. They made love with a tenderness that brought tears to Josephine's eyes, Pierce worshiping every inch of her body with his hands and mouth, murmuring words of love and devotion against her skin. Afterward, wrapped in his arms beneath the furs, Josephine felt a sense of completeness she had never known before. This was right. This was where she belonged. The years that followed were not without challenges. The first winter was brutal, testing Josephine's resolve more than once. There were days when the cold was so intense she could barely feel her fingers, when the snow piled so high they couldn't leave the cabin for weeks at a time. But Pierce was always there, teaching her, encouraging her, loving her with a steadiness that never wavered. She learned to set traps and skin game, to cure hides and make jerky. She learned which herbs could treat illness and which roots could be eaten in desperate times. She learned to read the sky for coming weather and the ground for animal tracks. Slowly, she transformed from a rancher's daughter into a true mountain woman, as tough and capable as any man. They visited Colorado City twice a year, bringing furs to trade and spending time with her father. Each visit, James Zimmerman would beg Josephine to stay, to come back to civilization, but she always refused. She could see that he was pleased despite his words, pleased that his daughter was happy and thriving in her chosen life. In the spring of their second year together, Josephine realized she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. Bringing a child into the world in the wilderness was dangerous, and she insisted they stay close to Colorado City for the final months. Pierce reluctantly agreed, and they spent the summer in a cabin just a few miles from town. Their son was born in early autumn, a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin. They named him Samuel, and Pierce wept openly when he held his son for the first time, this mountain man with his hard edges and scarred hands, cradling the tiny infant with infinite gentleness. "Thank you," he whispered to Josephine as she rested after the delivery. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving me a family. I never thought I'd have this." "We're just getting started," Josephine said with a tired smile. "Samuel's going to need brothers and sisters after all." Pierce laughed, the sound filled with pure joy. "Whatever you want, wife. Whatever you want." They raised Samuel in the mountains, teaching him the same skills Pierce had taught Josephine. The boy thrived in the wild, growing strong and confident. 2 years later, they had a daughter, bright-eyed and curious, whom they named Grace. She was followed by another son, then twin girls who kept them all on their toes. Life was hard but good. They built a larger cabin, one that could house their growing family comfortably. They cleared land for a small garden, and Pierce built a smokehouse and a root cellar. Josephine taught the children to read and write, using the few books they owned and making up lessons from the world around them. Pierce taught them to hunt and trap, to respect the wilderness and all its dangers. Jake Carson and his gang were never heard from again after that day on the rocky outcropping. Rumor had it they fled to Wyoming territory, where they were eventually hunted down by federal marshals. Pierce never spoke of them, but Josephine knew he was relieved. The shadow of that danger had finally lifted. On their 10th anniversary, Pierce took Josephine to a high meadow he had discovered, a place so beautiful it took her breath away. Wildflowers carpeted the ground in a riot of color, and a crystal-clear stream burbled through the center. The mountains rose all around them, their peaks touching the clouds. "I want to build us a new home here," Pierce said, taking her hands in his. "A place just for us, for when the children are grown and off living their own lives, a place where we can grow old together." Josephine looked at the meadow, then at her husband. He was in his late 30s now, his hair shot through with silver, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were still the same, still watching her with that intensity that made her heart skip. "It's perfect," she said, "absolutely perfect." They kissed there in the meadow, surrounded by wildflowers and mountains, and Josephine marveled at how far they had come. From that terrifying night when outlaws had taken her hostage to this moment of perfect peace and happiness, The journey had been extraordinary. Years passed. Samuel grew into a fine young man and eventually married a girl from Colorado City, bringing her back to the mountains to start his own life as a trapper. Grace became a teacher, settling in Denver, but visiting often with her husband and children. The younger children each found their own paths, some staying close to the mountains, others venturing further afield. Pierce and Josephine built their cabin in the high meadow, and it became a gathering place for their growing family. Summers were filled with grandchildren running through the grass, their laughter echoing off the peaks. Winters were quiet and peaceful, just the two of them and the vast wilderness they loved. On the evening of their 30th anniversary, they sat on the porch of their meadow cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. Josephine's hair was silver now, her hands marked with age, but Pierce still looked at her the way he had that first night, with wonder and love. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, the same question she had asked him all those years ago. "Leaving everything behind?" Josephine took his hand, their fingers interlocking with the ease of decades of practice. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You gave me a life of adventure and freedom. You gave me love beyond anything I could have imagined. You gave me a family and a home in these mountains. How could I ever regret that?" Pierce raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I was a man alone in the wilderness until I found you. You made me whole again, Josephine. You taught me it was possible to love, to hope, to believe in something beyond just surviving." "We saved each other," Josephine said softly. "That night when you tracked those outlaws and slipped me away, you saved my life. But in the years since, we've saved each other over and over again." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, brilliant pinpoints of light in the darkening sky. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to their love story, to the life they had built from the ashes of fear and violence. Josephine thought back to that terrified young woman tied to a tree, certain she would not survive the night. She could never have imagined then where her path would lead, could never have known that her darkest moment would become the gateway to her greatest happiness. But life, she had learned, was full of unexpected turns, and sometimes the most beautiful destinations were reached through the most challenging journeys. "I love you," she said to Pierce, the words as true now as they had been 3 decades ago. "My mountain man, my savior, my heart." "And I love you," Pierce replied, pulling her close. "My brave girl, my wife, my everything." The years continued to pass gently. They watched their grandchildren grow and have children of their own. They saw the territory around them change as more settlers arrived, as towns grew and railroads pushed ever deeper into the wilderness. But their meadow remained untouched, a sanctuary from the modern world creeping ever closer. Pierce's health began to fail in his 70th year. Nothing dramatic, just the slow wearing down that comes to all who live long lives. But even weakened, he refused to leave his mountains, and Josephine would never have asked him to. They had made their home here, and here they would stay until the end. On a crisp autumn morning, with the aspen leaves turned to gold and the air smelling of pine and coming snow, Pierce woke to find the world covered in the first frost of the season. Josephine was beside him as she had been for over 40 years, her hand in his. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice quiet but content. "It is," Josephine agreed, though she was looking at him rather than the frosted landscape. "I don't want to leave you," Pierce said, and Josephine felt her heart crack. "Then don't," she said fiercely, though they both knew it wasn't a matter of choice anymore. "Stay with me. Fight." "I've been fighting all my life," Pierce said with a gentle smile. "I think I'm ready to rest now, Josephine. But I'm not afraid. How can I be afraid when I've lived such a full life, when I've been loved by you?" Tears streamed down Josephine's face, but she nodded. "Then rest, my love. Rest knowing you were loved beyond measure. Rest knowing our children and grandchildren will carry on your legacy. Rest knowing I will remember every moment we shared, every adventure, every quiet evening by the fire. You made my life extraordinary, Pierce Patterson." Pierce squeezed her hand, his eyes never leaving her face. "That night I tracked those outlaws and slipped you away. I thought I was just doing what was right. I never imagined I was saving the woman who would save me in return. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. Josephine Zimmerman Patterson, The very best thing. He closed his eyes then, his breathing growing shallow and peaceful. Josephine held his hand and sang softly to him, old songs from their courting days, mountain ballads he had taught her. And when the sun reached its peak in the winter blue sky, Pierce took one last quiet breath and was gone. Josephine sat with him for a long while, memorizing the lines of his beloved face, the strength in his hands even now, the peace in his expression. Then she called their children, who had been waiting respectfully outside, and together they prepared to say goodbye to the man who had been the foundation of their family. They buried Pierce in the high meadow he loved, beneath a tall pine with the mountains rising all around. The entire family came, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and they shared stories late into the night, celebrating a life lived fully and well. Josephine stayed in the meadow cabin for 5 more years. Her children worried about her, alone in the wilderness at her age, but she refused to budge. This was her home, the home she had built with Pierce, and she would not abandon it. Besides, she was never truly alone. She felt Pierce's presence in every corner of the cabin, saw him in every sunset over the peaks, heard him in the whisper of wind through the pines. On a spring morning bursting with wildflowers, Josephine woke to find herself thinking of that first night, when a wild mountain man had slipped into an outlaw camp and cut her free. She thought of everything that had followed, the fear and the love, the challenges and the triumphs, the family they had built and the life they had shared. She had no regrets, not a single one. Josephine rose from her bed, made herself coffee the way Pierce had taught her all those years ago, and sat on the porch watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. It was a perfect morning, peaceful and full of promise, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over her. That evening, surrounded by photographs of her children and grandchildren, with Pierce's old rifle above the fireplace and his trapping tools hanging by the door, Josephine lay down to sleep. She dreamed of running through a mountain meadow, young and strong again, and in her dream, Pierce was waiting for her, his arms open wide and his smile lighting up his face. When her children found her the next morning, she was gone, but there was a smile on her face that told them everything they needed to know. She had lived well and loved deeply, and she had gone to join the man who had been her partner, her protector, and her greatest love. They buried her beside Pierce in the high meadow, and on her headstone they carved the words she had once spoken: "We saved each other." Because that, more than anything else, was the truth of their story. 2 souls who had found each other in the darkness and built a life filled with light. The meadow cabin stood for many years after, maintained by their descendants as a reminder of where they had come from, of the love story that had started it all. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would visit, walking the same trails Pierce and Josephine had walked, sitting on the same porch where they had watched countless sunsets, feeling the presence of their ancestors in the mountain air. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew just right through the pines, you could almost hear laughter echoing across the meadow, the sound of 2 souls who had found their forever home in each other and in the wild, beautiful mountains they loved. The story of Josephine and Pierce became legend in Colorado City and the surrounding territories, passed down through generations. It was a story of courage and love, of second chances and new beginnings. It was the story of how a terrified captive and a solitary mountain man had found each other in the wilderness and built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their separate lives. And it was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin in the most unexpected ways, and that true love, once found, can weather any storm, overcome any obstacle, and create a legacy that lasts long after the final chapter has been written. In the meadow where they rested, wildflowers bloomed every spring in a riot of color, fed by the mountain streams and warmed by the Colorado sun. And if you stood there quietly, breathing in the pine-scented air and listening to the whisper of wind through the trees, you might just feel the echo of a love that never truly died, a love that had become part of the mountains themselves, eternal and unchanging and utterly, beautifully complete.